This is Cultural Debris with host Alan Cornett.
Thomas Ward, welcome to Cultural Debris.
Thanks, Alan. It's good to be here.
You are in, right now, cold Waco, Texas, and you are a philosophy professor at Baylor University. Is that correct?
That's right. Those two facts don't have too much to do with each other, except that on this cold day, I'm in my office at Baylor and a little bit chilled.
Yeah, well, I suspect that you aren't able to pull out the Fair Isle sweater too often. So yeah.
That's right. It's a very welcome occasion. This is a vest, so I am sacrificing a little bit. I could do with a full sleeved sweater, but
yeah, I understand.
But I like it so much.
I've got the knitwear going here too, but I get a little bit more opportunity, I think, to wear that here than you do. But we're in the midst at the time of this recording of snow everywhere, but you don't have snow, you just have cold. So
just cold, and cold for us is if it's in the 20s, that's really cold. So we're a little bit spoiled down here, or soft, depending on your
that's we're always laughing when we go to Italy, because a lot of times we're there in October, in which time it is cooler there. I mean, it may drop into the 60s, 50s maybe, but you'll see the Italians with scarves wrapped around and big quilted coats on, and I don't think they could handle an actual winter, but I think Texas may be a little bit like that. So, well, you're a philosophy professor, and philosophy as an area of study is not perhaps at its zenith these days.
Yeah, maybe not. It's the field is extremely fragmented, and so in that sense reflects trends in higher education more generally. But in my little subfield is the history of medieval philosophy, and within my little guild, I feel like there are a bunch of us who are doing good work trying to recover the past, or at least preserve it, and can't speak to more techie contemporary subfields of the discipline, but but that's what I do.
Yeah. Those are right out as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if you're not talking about the medievals, and what are you even doing? But I mean, I am not a philosopher, and my formal training in philosophy is very rudimentary. I will say. However, it seems to me that a university, to be a university, has to have philosophy somewhere, and yet we see departments closing and being shuttered, and that seems to me to be a hollowing out of higher education as a whole.
I agree. It's when we think about the poor reputation of the humanities more generally these days, you can sort of line up your criticisms kind of from whatever ideological standpoint you occupy. So on the one hand, you might think, well, the humanities are useless, and that's why we shouldn't have them. Or they've been so politicized and in a leftist sort of way, and that's why we shouldn't have them. Shut down the departments and so on. But then from a different perspective, you might think, well, the humanities are preserving the writings of dead white men as though they have some sort of cultural authority or moral authority, and so that's why we got to blast them out. And so it's really. It's like you can find reasons to hate the humanities wherever you are on the ideological spectrum of American society. But I think that philosophy is a little bit unusual amongst the rest of the humanities. It hasn't actually been as politicized as a lot of the other humanities. English, history, comp lit. Yeah, I mean the sort of mainstream of those disciplines is critical perspectives. But that's not really true in philosophy. There's definitely creep in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably a trajectory that we're on, and hopefully we'll be able to resist it. But philosophy is insulated. And so I think that the primary reason for canceling philosophy these days tends to be just an ignorance about what it is, or ignorance about the value of the kinds of attitudes it cultivates, to be able to think about all of one's life, all of the disciplines of study, and to think about how they might integrate into a coherent vision of the world. I mean, that's really the business of the philosopher. And to the extent that people don't value that, or think that doesn't have the sort of financial incentive that they're looking for, then philosophy goes by the wayside. I have friends, UNC Asheville, which was sort of founded to be the kind of liberal arts center of the UNC system, wonderful system. They just canceled their philosophy department, and this is not teeny tiny private school that's not attracting students anymore. This is just, decently well-funded public university that just no longer sees the point.
Right. Well, I think that you, and by you I mean philosophy as a whole, that you have benefited from the fact that I think that philosophy has a bit of a moat around it as far as infiltration, because it is it's hard because it requires rigorous thought and extensive reading, and I think when it comes to philosophy that it's harder to fake it to some degree than it might be in field I have more training in, like history or English lit or something like that. So, but I think it's also sometimes seen, as I know are well aware, that as being a bit more esoteric. So you've got you've got a Socrates problem, I suppose.
Yeah.
When eventually
pay attention to us, we just annoy them.
That's right. And give the department hemlock, and it will leave us alone, I suppose. But well, I guess enough of hand wringing about that. But it is something that frustrates me, because I feel, though I am not a philosopher, I feel that philosophy has to be at the core of anything that's called a university to me, but that you're losing any kind of tie to the roots of the entire concept. But
yeah, and I'm sorry to say that even at some very good universities, this argument is not succeeding. I mean, even here at Baylor, you can get a Baylor degree without taking a single philosophy class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, perhaps it shall rally. We will see. I think eventually, the long game, it will.
Yeah.
Something you and I touched on before we started recording, but you have an MPhil from Oriel College at Oxford, and you were there in Oxford just this past summer, I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
What was it like studying at Oxford? You were there for a couple of years. I made a brief cameo appearance many years ago, back in the last century, but being there for a couple of years must have been a pleasant thing to do.
Yes. Yeah. I hate to say that it was the two best years of my life, because then I feel like the former high school quarterback whose glory days were a really long time ago.
I get it.
But sometimes I feel like they were the two best years of my life. I was, my wife and I married young, and we were there together. She wasn't a student, but worked a couple of different jobs while I was a student. One of the cool things we got to do was live at C.S. Lewis's house.
Oh, well,
Called
I would say that would rate pretty high on the cool list.
So he and his brother Warney bought a house in I think the early 30s, 1930s, just about 3 miles outside of Oxford, toward just off the London Road. So it was call it a 15-minute or so bike ride or bus ride into town. And so in that sense, we weren't right there in the thick of things, but we were going in every day anyway. So we got the best of Lewis's old brick house and the sort of the parks and the greens that were adjacent to the cul-de-sac that has kind of grown up around his house, while also enjoying everything that Oxford had to offer. So it was great. It was great.
Well, you're gonna have to go into that a little bit more. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't let you off the hook on dropping that you lived in C.S. Lewis's house.
Yeah. Well, I haven't caught up. I'm not up with the latest on this, but there's a foundation, or at least there was a foundation called the C.S. Lewis Foundation, who, among other things, other activities, they own this house, and they, for a long time, maybe still, students, usually graduate students, would live there, and someone would be the kind of head resident and responsible for maintaining the house and keeping it clean, and also giving tours. So my wife and I gave dozens and dozens of tours of the house, and sadly, the house was not preserved after Warney died, and so I mean, it was, the structure still remains, but it wasn't preserved, as a museum or anything like that. So it fell into other ownership, and it was eventually bought, I think, in the 80s by the C.S. Lewis Foundation. And what they did, in order to make it look as authentic as possible on the inside, they gathered as many photographs taken from inside the kilns while the brothers lived there, and tried to reconstruct the furniture, the wallpaper, and that sort of thing. And it certainly had a kind of homey 1940s, 50s sort of feel to it. Not extravagant, not too shabby, but a little shabby, as is appropriate.
Yeah, you would want it to be a little shabby.
Yeah. Now, one thing they did not do was smoke enough cigarettes to saturate the walls, the sort of nicotine yellow that should have been on the walls. Instead, they try to do a sort of sponge paint thing.
They didn't require that the grad students smoke an X amount of cigarettes a day or anything.
That's right. Now, I did smoke a pipe in the sitting room a couple of times. I probably shouldn't have done that, but
well, of course you should have. I mean, you're able to say that you did. So what? I can't see the negative at all. So
one surprising, perhaps not so surprising thing about all the tours that we gave is that I'd say over 90% of the tourists were Americans.
Yeah, that doesn't. It's not something I guess I would have thought of necessarily, but that also doesn't surprise me. I mean, my understanding is Lewis is much bigger here than he is in the UK.
Yeah.
Even today. And I would assume that his star is probably a little brighter than it used to be in the UK, but still, I think,
Yeah. I think
Notre Dame has all the stuff. And so,
yeah. What I think at this point, there's just the kilns that anything of his that remains in England, I think, is the house itself. And even that, last time I checked, is owned by Americans.
Yeah.
That
is interesting. And of course, I mean, Oxford didn't have quite the appreciation that they should have even during his lifetime, because he ended up having to go to Cambridge. So
I was thinking about this just recently. There's something about the fact that Tolkien, once he started his career at Leeds, I think, but came back as a kind of fairly young academic, and then was there his entire career. And there's always been something just a little bit melancholy to me about the Cambridge chapter of Lewis's life. Wouldn't it have been nice if he had stayed? And why exactly did he leave? Was it the prestige? Wasn't the money? And I'm sure someone has a good answer to this. I don't know myself. Maybe you do, but
well, I mean, I've read biographical accounts that essentially, I mean, I think he could have stayed at Oxford, but they wouldn't give him a chair.
Yeah.
And Cambridge would, and I think probably he felt like probably all of us have at some point or another that we are underappreciated, and
yeah,
he I think a lot of his colleagues seemingly resented his popular success because he was quite well known, had the radio, was on the radio, and had his popular books and so forth, famous at least in the Anglosphere, and I think that resentment of others probably hurt him. It's interesting though that Tolkien perhaps didn't suffer the same, but I saw that that Bradley Berzer has just completed a new book on the Inklings. It's not published yet, but I just saw on social media that he had posted that he had sent in the manuscript.
Yeah, well, that would be worth reading.
Yeah, so I think that maybe he will dig into some of that. But I do very much look forward to that book. So I think it will be worthwhile, and hopefully we'll get Brad back on the podcast. Brad was my very first guest, actually, on Cultural Free. Yeah, so may twist his arm to get him back on when that book does come out. So we'll do a to be continued on the Lewis discussion. I did have
a few admirers here in Waco.
Yeah, I imagine so. I did have Father Ward on to discuss, and we discussed Lewis. I suppose he would probably have some good answers.
Yeah, he'd be the one to ask, or one of the ones to ask. Funny connection with Father Ward, no relation, but he was our predecessor at the Kilns.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, maybe I need to get a list of all the residents, the grads, and just have them on the podcast, because you're the second one now. So, well, you are the author of a new book from Word on Fire called After Stoicism, which so Stoicism, you could have called it Stoicism the sequel, maybe, or
yeah.
But Stoicism is very very in these days. So After Stoicism, subtitled "Last Words of the Last Roman Philosopher," and so there is an unnamed last Roman philosopher there. Who is this person that is unsaid but is looming behind the cover?
Right. So it was as an academic, we're always supposed to be as explicit and clear as possible. So leaving Boethius out of the title seemed almost like I was pulling a trick on people. But of course, hardly anyone has heard of Boethius these days, but lots of people have heard of Stoicism and of Rome. And so we decided we wanted to really project that and situate Boethius as a Roman philosopher. So all these guys who, remember the meme, I think last year, about how, what do guys really spend their time thinking about?
Right.
Is the Roman Empire. So is that sort of thing. But yeah, Boethius, the early 6th century AD Roman philosopher and senator who was unjustly accused of treason. Maybe we can get into that background a little bit, and was sentenced to death. And while he was waiting to die, wrote down this beautiful work of philosophy.
And here I will hold up this
Yeah.
my copy of this,
A beautiful
which
copy of the beautiful book.
I already owned this. I did not buy it for this for this discussion, but that's the folio edition, which I don't know if that's actively in print, but you can find those without much difficulty. It's beautifully done. A little plug, and I've done this before, but a little plug for folio books. They're beautifully done, and one of the better publishers as far as just attractive volumes go, and they usually choose good things. But Boethius was back long ago when I was an undergrad. I was actually assigned the Consolation of Philosophy in a class and read it, and and was immediately attracted as a youngster to Boethius, and so I've always had sort of Boethius in the back of my brain, and as you probably are aware, he doesn't come up very often. So when he did, I thought, oh, this is great. But it's interesting. Of course, Boethius is largely a forgotten figure, but during his lifetime, and we'll talk also for some time after, Boethius was a pretty big deal. And tell us a little bit about who he was. I mean, you've touched on that, but he did a lot in a lot of areas.
Yeah, I mean, he was not just a senator, but married into the household of Symmachus, so who was one of the paterfamilias of one of the grandest aristocratic families of Rome. Boethius himself became master of offices in the last year or two of his career, which is roughly the equivalent of chief of staff or something to the king. And I do mean king. So here at this stage in the history of Rome, we no longer have emperors. We have Gothic kings. And in particular, in the life of Boethius, it's King Theodoric. Some people say Theodoric. I say Theodoric. That's who I'm talking about. And so King Theodoric elevated Boethius to his master of offices only a short time before this accusation of treason was leveled against him. So I mean, we got to think of Boethius as not just a senator, but one of the most illustrious, most prestigious, most famous men in what remained of the Roman Empire. He was also a scholar, and in particular, a philosopher and a theologian. And it's the latter part, the theologian, that sometimes gets forgotten. He wrote 5 short books of theology, 3 of which had to do with what we might think of as interventions in theological disputes between the Eastern and Western churches. Boethius seems to have been involved in trying to broker a kind of peace or reunion of a temporary schism called the Acacian Schism. Now, that theological work may have been part of the foundation of his of this accusation of treason, because after all, to reunite the Eastern and Western churches, when in the East you had the Caesaro-papalist sort of ideal of temporal governance, that represented a threat to Theodoric. And so it may have been that the closer that the Eastern and Western churches got together, the closer the Eastern and Western kingdoms would come together, and that would threaten Theodoric's power. So there may have been some real foundation to the charge of treason, even though it doesn't actually, on Boethius's part, seem to have been politically motivated.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, he had this life of a scholar alongside his life as a politician. And that's why when he found himself in prison, he had these intellectual resources to write such a book. I mean, he was basically just calling from memory everything that he had ever read and trying to put it together into a package that would offer him, as the title suggests, some consolation in his final days.
So he was a translator, translated Aristotle,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly skilled in Greek, which was rare at the time.
Unusual for the time, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Was also wrote about music at a high level, just a polymath, really, but an extraordinarily powerful politician, among probably, I mean, you'd have to say among the most powerful politicians of his day. And he was relatively young during all of this. I mean, he dies, what, at 44 or something?
Yeah.
Mid-40s, early to mid-40s. So he's done all of this before he's even reached, we'll say 45. That's not bad. It's not bad output at that point. I mean, usually you would think that somebody like him would kind of, later in his career do his writing and translating, and when things are kind of slowing down a little bit. But it'd be extraordinary to think what he might have done had he lived.
No, that's right. And he tells us in his some of his commentaries that his ambition was to translate the whole of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, so that his countrymen could benefit from Greek wisdom.
So would he still have had access to what are now the lost works of Aristotle? I don't know the timeline of those.
Oh, right. I don't know.
Yeah. No, me either, but I'm just curious. Although that's tantalizing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But so you made a reference here that I think it needs to be emphasized, which is when he writes the Consolation, he is under house arrest, but not in his house, or is in prison. He is incarcerated, we'll say. We don't know exactly the conditions that he had, to my understanding, but he was not living at home with access to his library, which I want to talk about his library because it gets mentioned.
Yeah.
But he's doing all of this, essentially off the top of his head, and he's making a lot of references to the great philosophical tradition, and reasoning through that. The Stoics, yes, but further back, as you were saying, Plato and Aristotle were very much on his radar as a translator. So explain what, I guess, the structure of the book. How is he examining these things?
Yeah. So I like to think of Boethius, the author, as for all of his power and prestige, actually a very humble man. And here's why. He writes this book with he himself as one of the two main characters. So there's Boethius, the character, who is portrayed in prison, and so just as Boethius, the author, was himself while he was writing. And then the other main character is this mysterious lady whose appearance she's neither young nor old. Is she tall? Is she normal sized? She has a fine dress, but it's tattered and sooty. This lady appears to him, and she seems to sort of be or to represent all of philosophy. And so as this spokeswoman for the whole philosophical tradition that Boethius had learned, she and Boethius, the character, have a dialogue where Lady Philosophy is trying to heal him, essentially. We'll talk a little bit more about what was supposed to be wrong with him in a minute. But so she takes him through a sort of course of what I think of as philosophical therapy to get him out of his doldrums.
Right.
Now, why does that suggest that Boethius was a humble man? Well, because the character Boethius starts off, he's not a very admirable person. You know, he basically shames himself in print. And even though that character undergoes some serious improvement, it's not like a hero's tale where Boethius the character by the end is someone that all our eyes are focusing on. You know, the attention stays in many ways on Lady Philosophy and in what Lady Philosophy herself is directing Boethius to, which is God and divine things. But Boethius the character, he sort of gets his mojo back, but then sort of slides out of the main focus of the book. But that's the basic structure.
Well, and it is again worth noting that he's doing all of this in prison. I mean, when we start the book, and the reason why he's depressed is because he has lost literally everything in his life: his prestige, his status, his wealth, his library, and we also know that at the end of this episode, whatever, I don't know how long it took from the time of this writing, but Boethius is going to die. He doesn't get out. He's going to be executed for this. So, and obviously he's a savvy fellow and would assume that that's exactly what's going to happen to him unless there's some sort of intervention that obviously did not come. But so these really are the writings of a condemned man, a doomed individual. And yet he's dealing in this high level philosophical dialogue, as you say, with himself as kind of the lesser party. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, I would at least guess with some assurance that that's really how Boethius thought at the time. I mean, I think probably philosophical therapy is a good way to put it, because he's trying to work himself through his intellectual knowledge out of this psychological trauma that he's understandably in. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think any of us would feel at least as bad as Boethius did if we were in the same position. Unjustly accused of treason and doomed to die.
And he's mad about it and sad about it. He's in fact he's full of fear. You know, when the book opens, we find him crying, and when he and Lady Philosophy first start talking, there's this early exchange where essentially she asks, "Well, tell me what's wrong," and he says this long speech. Now, if you just take that speech, you know, and kind of excise it from the rest of the book, you could almost see it as the kind of exercise that any number of accused, you know, powerful people fallen from grace would write. You know, sort of, here's my side of the story. I've been unjustly treated. I'm going to name names. I'm going to say how I see it. I'm going to say how it really went down, so that when I'm gone, someone's going to read this and realize that they got it all wrong. You know, a kind of desire for vindication.
Sure.
And whether he wrote that first and then composed something around it, or whether it was theirs, you know, from the original plan, we have no idea. But Lady Philosophy hears him out, lets him sort of say his piece, and it says, "Oh, okay, well, now I know what's wrong with you." And it's not what the character had been led to expect. What's wrong with him is that he's so upset about all of this stuff that he shouldn't be so upset about.
Right.
And that's the sort of the first major intervention that sets up the rest of the dialogue as a more philosophical dialogue. You know, Lady Philosophy is not interested in examining the past to see who was right and who was wrong and who's guilty, who's innocent. That's not what Boethius needs at this stage in his life.
And that's really, I think the way you set that up, that's really, I think, a touch point with how we understand Stoicism. That the Stoic would say, okay, I'm in this horrible situation, or at least a situation that would be viewed by most as horrible. But from a standpoint of Stoic detachment, I really shouldn't be upset about this.
Mm-hmm.
That would be kind of the Stoic approach. That, well, this outside circumstance should not dictate my internal being. But he has more than Stoicism, and Lady Philosophy is not Lady Stoicism.
Yeah.
Even though Stoicism is given a nod, right? But how is this after Stoicism? Go back to the title. How does Lady Philosophy and how does Boethius, how do they transcend mere Stoicism, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sense of after here is we could think about it in a few different ways. On the one hand, as you mentioned earlier, right now there seems to be a kind of revival of interest in Stoicism, mm-hmm. and then it's worth thinking about why now. Times are always hard, so but interest in Stoicism is comes and goes, and so what is it about our current moment? But then also you could think about Boethius himself as occupying, literally chronologically, a period in history where it is chronologically after the major Stoic philosophers that we remember today, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, and so on. But then also there's after Stoicism in the sense that Boethius himself appreciated so much of the wisdom of the Stoics, but didn't think that it was enough. And so there needed to be something else, something that came after. And even the structure of the Consolation of Philosophy represents that. So Lady Philosophy, when Boethius is still upset and dejected, she can't deliver sort of the whole philosophical picture that she eventually wants him to be able to glimpse. She has to get him really to calm down. And the way that she goes about that is to try to give this sort of talk therapy where she talks through all of the things that Boethius is upset about and shows how it's not worth being upset about, at least to the degree that you're upset about it. There's so much in our lives that we can't control, and if we somehow think that our potential for happiness is tied to keeping control of the things that are uncontrollable, well, then we'll always be bound to be miserable, because not only will we eventually lose them because they're outside of our control, but we'll be worried about them all the time, even while we enjoy them, right? So the life of attachment to material things and to social prestige and to wealth and so on, that life can't actually give you what you're really seeking. So there's a sort of destructive Stoic component of the book. But then, having tried to detach from Boethius from the things he can't control, that's the Stoic part, she then tries to move him on to a great hope in something that is not fully within his control, God himself, but offers the hope of a true happiness. So the thing about Stoicism is that because so much of life is outside of our control, the Stoics thought happiness is not something that we can rationally hope for. We have to give up on our longing for happiness and accept something more like tranquility. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit Buddhist in that sense, in that respect anyway. And so, and that's the major difference between Boethius and the Stoics, at least when it comes to their ethical thought. Boethius thought not only that it's rational to hope for true happiness, but that we can't help but do so.
Mm-hmm.
That there's something about our psychologies that are just hardwired in the direction of happiness, so that training ourselves simply to be detached, apathetic, is actually a kind of psychological violence that we have to do to ourselves. And maybe we can't even achieve it anyway, even if we try really hard. And so that's that directing Boethius away from mere detachment toward hope that is what comes after Stoicism.
And of course, it's vital in all of this that to understand that Boethius actually is a Christian, thus the works on theology and so forth. But he's operating as a Christian in a time when Christianity wasn't dominant in the way it would be later. So being a Christian was not, maybe we would say, not unusual, but also not necessarily safe. A safe choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's so Theodoric and his barbarians were actually Arian Christians, so heretics, but officially worshipped God and Jesus in the way that Arians did. I can't remember the Arian missionary who went to Germany, but there's some Arians got to certain parts of Germany before the Catholics did, and did some damage there. So when I think Odoacer was an Arian too, but anyway, when the Goths came down, they had already been evangelized just into heresy.
Right.
But yeah, I think it was dangerous, because you had Justin in the East. He had to deal with the Monophysite controversy a bit, but he himself was Orthodox, and certainly on the question of Arianism, that wasn't an issue anymore for anyone in the East. But the Catholics in the West had to deal with the fact that the official government was Arian. Theodoric had been tolerant to Catholics, but Emperor Justin sort of decided I think this was in the early 520s, decided to go after the Arians by confiscating Arian church property, and for the good of the Catholics, of the Orthodox Christians in Byzantium, to turn those churches into Orthodox churches. This enraged Theodoric, and he lashed out at Catholics in his own domain. And so this is why I said earlier, part of that part of what might have been in the background of the accusation of treason against Boethius was that, as a Catholic and as someone who was actively supporting the union of East and West on issues about Christology, he might have represented a real threat to Theodoric, because, hey, look, those guys in the East are going after the Arians. You, Boethius, and some of your buddies here, you seem to support what they're doing over there. So we're not friends anymore.
Right. And politically, Boethius puts himself in this position because he stands up. I guess the triggering incident. He stands up and defends another politician who's been accused of treason, which is, at least in his opinion, a false charge, and seems to be known to be a false charge. And he risks himself by standing up and publicly denouncing the accusation of this other person. And that puts him, I guess, guilt by association and really opens him up. So this was kind of it was a moment of bravery on his part, courage on his part, but it's a situation where he could have just been sort of keep your head down and be quiet situation, and so he makes a choice that he had to know could send him down on this path, I would assume.
Yeah, it would make a really good movie. You could just imagine the drama of it. You know, the Albinus was the senator who was accused, and in this case, there was a paper trail. They seemed to Albinus had been exchanging letters with imperial officials back east, and it's like, wouldn't it be nice if the Italian peninsula were under control of the Catholics again, and that sort of thing. So in his case, there might have been some legitimacy, but yeah, this was totally gratuitous on Boethius's part. I mean, there's really nothing to be gained unless it was something like this. You could imagine a situation where Boethius felt so confident in his status, his reputation with the king, that if Boethius himself were to refute the charge, then of course no one would believe it. So it may have been that he didn't actually think that he was doing something that risky. We just don't know. We do have, a chronicle written fairly close to the events. So this report of Boethius standing up and saying, Albinus is innocent, but if he is guilty, then I'm guilty too, and the whole Senate is guilty, but the charges are false, my Lord King. So we have his words, but of course we don't have what was going through his mind while he said it. But I do like to think of it as a genuinely brave thing to do, even if he had some confidence, even overconfidence, that his stature would sway the decision in his own favor. Still, I think it was a brave thing to do. This was a serious charge.
Sure. Right. Well, I mean, anytime, and maybe he did think he had a level of protection. I'm sure he did to some degree, but anytime you insert yourself into those sorts of situations, you're opening up a potential can of worms, I think, as Boethius obviously found out. So we can't leave the discussion of Boethius, and of course, I mean, leave it to folks to read Consolation, but also your guide to their understanding of it, to fully grasp what's going on. And I will say your book is very helpful with that, because as a layman when it comes to philosophical matters, sometimes the intricacies of what Lady Philosophy has to say can maybe get a little tedious. But one of the things that comes up in the book that I feel like we have to touch on was this reference to Boethius's library. I had library envy. So he's an extremely wealthy individual, of course, very powerful. No doubt would have had probably one of the better collections, or at least private collections in existence, I would imagine. But they make reference to what was in his library, and what do they say about it?
But the only thing that I'm recalling right now is not any particular volume, but that it was decorated in glass and ivory.
Right.
Yeah, ivory.
Yes. I mean, it sounds like just the sort of library that you would see on Instagram, right? Yes. Scrolls everywhere. Mm-hmm. Probably he would have smoked a pipe if he could have. Right. But I
appreciate so much that you are attending to this, to Boethius' library, because it just fires my imagination.
Absolutely.
I think of the glass, almost like a stained glass kind of thing is what pops into my mind, which is historically inaccurate. But you just have light streaming through these mullioned windows, and maybe even some glass covers on some of the finer shelves, like you have behind you, protecting your brandies and so on.
There are some books in there too.
Yeah, I could yeah.
But yeah, so when you read something like that, you feel a little bit of, Boethius is he's like me, there's a he's like me with more money, prestige, and power, and smarter, but nonetheless.
You could imagine the Consolation of Philosophy starring Mr. Toad as Boethius.
Yeah, I think that we really do need to, maybe we need to pitch this as a movie.
Yeah.
We could have an opening scene in the library, and but I saw someone recently on Twitter who was bemoaning, I can't remember, some major historical event that had never been treated as a movie. And it's like, I'm sorry, the best we can do is, yet another Spider-Man reboot or whatever it is, when you see things like this, the life of Boethius, and, as far as exciting lives, Boethius isn't even at the top of the list by any means, but I feel like there's a treasure trove of opportunity there, but we'll never get it. So I do want folks, and we're going to talk just for a second about another book of yours, but I do want to show people again the After Stoicism, which is from Word on Fire, and Word on Fire does a beautiful job. And by the way, I always have to make praise whenever this happens. There is a ribbon.
I can't tell you how happy I was when I got the book finally in my hand and I saw that it had a ribbon. I thought, wow, I've made it. That's
absolutely. I feel like there should be, and maybe we should contact people in the new administration in Washington about this, but there needs to be some kind of legal directive that at least all hardcover books should come with a ribbon.
Yeah, this should be part of the sort of a sister project to the architectural renewal that has been discussed by the incoming administration. So federal buildings have to have certain aesthetic standards,
right?
And hardcover books have to have
a ribbon marker for sure. Before I let you go, I do want to touch on an earlier book of yours, Ordered by Love, an introduction to John Duns Scotus, from Angelico Press. And at one time, you and I were going to discuss this in a podcast that never quite happened, but I don't want to let you go without touching on it. This book came out, was it 2022?
Yeah.
Was it that long ago?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. We should have talked long before now, but
Scotus, maybe even less well known than Boethius.
Right. Yes. I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
But seemingly, like Boethius, should be more well known. I mean, I will say this. Let me make this point about Boethius, which I meant to make but didn't. Following his death and the publication of Consolation, it was essentially a standard text for any educated person for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not read like it ought to be now, but it was a standard text that anybody would have read.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis says somewhere that up until about 200 years ago, you'd be you wouldn't be able to find an educated man in Europe who not only had never read the Consolation, but who didn't like it. You know, it was just it was a bestseller. It was a popular book. You know, partly because you could, well, for all sorts of reasons, but yeah, it really was that big. I mean, King Alfred the Great had it translated. Chaucer translated it. Queen Elizabeth I translated it. And on and on and on. It was just you can't overstate its influence on Western thought and culture.
And going along with Lewis, since we do have a Lewis theme going here,
yeah,
Lewis recommended reading old books, right? In his
that's right,
his Athanasius intro,
yeah,
and so that is one that if you want insight not only to how a great philosopher of the end of the Roman age thought, but also the kind of thinking that would have influenced people for 1,000 years, really. And we've lost touch with a lot of those springs of influence that are easily regained by actually reading it. And now we have a handy guide from you to do so. Okay, so back to John Duns Scotus, somewhat overshadowed by I think another theologian around the same time.
Yeah, maybe someone is that some of you have heard of before. This guy named Aquinas.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So bad luck in coming along and being a theologian during the time of Aquinas, right? I got to go. By the way, I haven't mentioned this in the podcast because I haven't recorded one since it happened. But the skull of Aquinas was on tour recently, and he came to Kentucky, and I got to go and see and venerate the skull of Aquinas, and went to mass with the skull of Aquinas there. So the brain was once encased in that skull that overshadowed John Duns Scotus. That's our connection here. But Aquinas never imagined he would come to Kentucky, and I'm afraid, but come he did. So Scotus was a Franciscan, is that right? Franciscan, that and was recently beatified, but has not been canonized.
That's right. Yeah, beatified by JP2 in 1993.
By the way, I know I keep doing this, but why isn't Boethius a saint?
You know, officially he is.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah. There's some technical issues here that I don't have quite the right language for. So, you know, anyone with a canon law background or something, you know, you'll have to just excuse my barbarisms here. But he is in the Roman martyrology.
Okay.
In the 1880s, there was an official confirmation of his cultus. So he's listed sort of in the whatever the official roster is, but he's only like liturgically memorialized in the Diocese of Pavia, where he's interred. So you couldn't, without special permission from your bishop, if you were a priest, you couldn't like say a Boethius Mass on October 23rd. And so it doesn't mean that he's less of a saint. He's just not universally recommended to be commemorated. And so just pardon me for not knowing exactly what's going on.
Sure. Well, I mean, you know more about how to explain this than I do. So he actually is Saint Boethius.
Yeah, Saint Severinus Boethius. Yeah, martyr.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you clearing that up for me. John Duns Scotus, not a saint.
Not a saint.
So tell me a little bit about Scotus. Why don't we know much about Scotus, or maybe let me rephrase that. Why is Scotus not widely known?
Yeah.
And why should he be better, more widely studied?
Yeah. Part of why he's not widely known is because the vast majority of theologians of the church are not widely known. Only when, someone like Aquinas um, is this towering figure that, most lay people have heard of, even if they've never studied at all. Now, Scotus has this funny sort of history because he was extremely well known in intellectual circles, at least academic intellectual circles in Europe throughout the modern era into the 19th century. Now, part of what happened, I think, is that when Pope Leo XIII published Aeterni Patris, in which he recommended a revival of the study of the text of St. Thomas Aquinas, that there was a bit of a reaction that involved neglecting certain figures of the Catholic theological tradition that had been studied alongside Aquinas as of comparable importance. So neglect of some of these, what we now think of as lesser figures, and a turn toward the giant that Aquinas is, and rightly is considered as such. So I think that's a big part of it. So another big part of it is that Scotus's own textual tradition, what he actually left behind, was in a really disorganized state. So there was, even as he was still considered a prominent figure, there were disputes about what was actually his and what belonged to followers of his, and so that the textual tradition is chaotic. In fact, part of the story about his very late canonization, not till 1993, what's up with that, is that in the 20th century, I think starting in the 1930s, there was a commission set up at the Vatican to try to organize in a scholarly way Scotus's writings for the purpose of examining them to see whether or not he was sort of a candidate for canonization. And by the 90s, enough of that work had been done that JP2 felt confident in declaring him beatified. So that's pretty cool. Now, why we haven't gone, the next step? Maybe we're waiting on a miracle. I myself ask for Blessed John Duns Scotus' intercession, sometimes just to understand what he's saying.
Well, yeah, from what I understand, he's not the easiest to read.
Yeah, and that brings me to the third reason why he's not more appreciated, is that he is just a very, very difficult writer to understand. When you think about part of the genius of Aquinas is that he was such a good teacher. Whether it's clear writing, it's not to say that Aquinas is easy, but
I don't think anybody would accuse
him
of that.
Clear writing, and he wrote at different levels, so he wrote his really technical stuff meant for experts. He wrote the stuff that he at least thought was more for beginners. It's all very organized and coherent. Whereas Scotus was a bit more all over the place. You got to think of him, I think, as a kind of erratic genius, just a hyperactive mind, where a lot of that energy didn't express itself in a pedagogical way. He was just trying to get it all down. But aside from those reasons why he's not more widely read, he is respected by Catholics who know this as one of the theologians most responsible for developing the doctrine, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And that's really, I think, more than any other teaching of his, I think that's what the church most values him for. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of nice, so he does have his place. No one can gainsay him. But some people in sort of the other circles of the Catholic intellectual tradition, particularly some Thomists or Thomist adjacent people, view Scotus sometimes with suspicion, due to very technical aspects of his thought. And part of my work on Scotus has been to try to convince Catholics that, hey, Scotus might be hard. You don't have to love him, but hey, he's not that bad. And that's what this book, the Ordered by Love, Scotus has actually been he's been the historical figure I've worked on more than any other as a scholar. And so what I wanted to do for Scotus, really as a kind of, in a sense of piety, was to offer something to people that could represent Scotus in a way that they might be able to find him attractive and to see what's valuable there. So I think of it as cheerleading for Scotus. This is not scholarship, but it's cheerleading for Scotus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah.
Ordered by Love is the earlier book on Scotus that we were just talking about. It is a relatively slim volume. Around 150 pages, looks like, or so. So easy to pick up and learn about a perhaps unjustly overshadowed scholar. Then the current book, or the current work that we were talking about, After Stoicism, which is easy to pick up from Word on Fire, just out in the past few months. I mean, it's brand new.
Yeah, it's still on Amazon, but the Word on Fire people ran out of copies in their own warehouse. You can't order it from the publisher's warehouse, but you can still from Amazon.
Okay. Yeah, but I do recommend that. But also certainly the original work that is based on Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, which is a work that is literally foundational to Western thought. That any educated individual would have read and would have been very familiar with. And so,
could I recommend another translation? Not because I think that the one that you're suggesting is bad.
I don't expect everybody to go pick up the Folio Society.
No, it's a fine translation and a fine edition.
And this is was it the Watts?
Yeah, Watts.
Yeah, this is the Watts translation, which is the Penguin.
Yeah,
the Penguin
so you
translation.
can find that translation in like a paperback Penguin Classics.
Right.
But another one to consider is this by Scott Goins and Barbara Wyman, and this one is published by Ignatius Press.
Oh, okay. So that's from Ignatius, and that's currently in print.
Currently in print. It's actually very inexpensive. It's less than $10 on Amazon.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But one thing that's nice about it, I love the translation, great notes, but it also includes the 4 or 5 interpretive essays at the back that are meant to be teaching essays. Not secondary scholarship on the Consolation, but just smart essays meant to help first-time readers just sort of get their feet in Boethius and his worldview. So yeah, another translation recommendation. Yeah. Goins and
yes,
Wong.
Thanks for that. And I should pick that up myself, actually, since I do not have that particular one, so that would be useful. Well, Thomas Ward, thank you very much for your time, and I've enjoyed it, and also enjoyed your tales of Oxford, and those are I feel like I could just turn this podcast into discussions of Oxford and libraries, and so we've hit on both of those.
And Oxford has a lot of libraries.
They do.
I would often go to libraries in Oxford that I didn't really need to be there for anything except for the fact that they were beautiful.
Right. Well, yes. So that I'll try not to get started on my complaints about modern libraries, which are not places you want to be in. Mm-hmm. The proper sort of library is what Boethius had. It's what, when from the garden at Exeter, you could see the Bodleian right there. And, that's what you want. That's what you want it to be. You want dark, you want wood paneling, you want that kind of thing.
Yeah.
lots of shells where you might get lost, and I don't know. Then a murder happens, and they have to bring in a British private detective to solve it or something. But do a genre crossover here. Thomas Ward, thank you very much. I recommend everybody pick up your books, and I hope that you survive the cold blast in Texas and things warm up for you. But at least you get to wear the sweater.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks a lot.